Jonah is the most successfully miserable prophet in history. You see, when prophets are living, they're often ignored, maligned, ridiculed, slandered, and rejected. They speak God's message with their lips and actions, but we rarely heed their warnings or take up their criticisms and demands for change. They consistently remind us of the consequences of our arrogance, our ignorance, and our claims of goodness, blessedness, and God's preferences. We change easily when we see the benefits before us. We oppose change vehemently when we recognize that this could risk loss or require some personal sacrifice. Jonah and his message was heeded, which doesn't usually happen with prophets. They're usually ignored. And it was the most successful conversion ever. And it drove him absolutely crazy. But after prophets have passed away, we then find ourselves visiting the historical sites where they lived, conveniently forgetting all of our vitriol, our ridicule, and our rejection of their messages when they were with us. We do this just like those before us did. There were monuments erected to former prophets. Because first of all, we tend to criminalize their actions. Then they tend to find themselves martyred, killed. And then we all act like, well, we always agreed with them all along. Jonah was the only prophet in our scriptures to successfully deliver a message of change that was not only accepted, but also embraced by cows as well as kings. And still, Jonah hated this outcome. How dare God creatively include my enemy as part of God's mercy? Yet, how abundant was God's grace extended to Jonah as he ignored God's call, as he ran from it, risked other lives through his disobedience, and waited until the shade of a shrub, hell-bent on seeing his way of loving through violent destruction revealed. Jonah's enemies, the Ninevites, changed their minds. God, in response to their changed hearts, changed his mind. But Jonah refused to change anything. Israel ignored its prophets at peril over and over again. And so do we. We disconnect and hang up on God when we do not like what we are hearing. We only want to hear when God has come around to our way of thinking, our outlooks, our preferences. The other side, which we always have another side to, is just not only a worthy opponent stopping us, but is seen as a mortal enemy, a demonic force that deserves nothing less than going to hell. That is what Jonah and his countrymen thought of the city of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, those who had conquered Israel. And if we are honest, we too would share quickly our recommendations for those who deserve direct tickets and flights to hell. And we also wait for God to second all of our hell-bent motions. But in those moments, we could not be any farther from God than Jonah was in trying to put as much seed between God's message to Nineveh and his obedience to do what God told him to do. We so quickly disconnect from what we do not like to hear, from either God or our neighbor. Yet we need God's mouthpieces with their challenging words within our community to remind us of the need to connect, the necessary relationship with God and neighbor, whether as individuals or within the institutions that espouse certain priorities or beliefs. Yet God's calling for us to be radically different in those priorities or beliefs that we desperately want to keep, rather than even entertain the idea of possibly compromise or surrender. God reconnects with Jonah amid every effort that Jonah tries to disconnect from God and the call to change. And everyone who encounters Jonah during his journey connects to Jonah's God through Jonah's denial, through Jonah's arguments, and through Jonah's warnings. Whether it is the men on Jonah's escape pod, in this sense, the boat that first tries to save him and then sacrifices him, and even prays to Jonah's God for mercy, or as he easily declares the destruction of the capital city of his hated rulers in just one day, when the city is 3 days in size, where the word that Jonah uses for destruction could also be heard as meaning change. And those hated Ninevites did change. Unlike the kings and the elites and the priests of the land of Israel, who over and over again rejected, ignored, and defied the warnings given from God. Did you know that Jonah's name means dove? And Jonah's father's name, that's mentioned only in the first couple verses of the book, Amittai, means faithfulness. So we have dove, the son of faithfulness. And there are 16 times where the word dove is used in the Old Testament, and 15 of those are positive. Perhaps the most familiar to us is the one with the dove of peace being sent out after Noah's flood to confirm that the creation could receive life again. But Jonah, despite his name as dove of faithfulness, brings no peace and certainly acts faithless more often than faithful. Jonah resists God's call, and Jonah would rather flee from God's presence. Either one of these acts, resisting the call and fleeing from the presence of God should have sent Jonah not just to the far edge of the world, but in a place of God's eternal absence. And yet, God did not resist or flee from extending over and over again mercy to Jonah. God pursued Jonah, provided for the rescue, reinstated the call. Our scripture this morning said a second time God told Jonah, and dealt with Jonah's unholy anger with deep patience and long suffering, and remained with the prophet even as he threw the largest hissy fit over the death of a plant, overseeing God's will of mercy being done rather than complying with Jonah's own desire of unrelenting condemnation for his enemies while denying his need or recognizing any of the grace that had been extended to him during the journey to Nineveh. The story of Jonah invites us to correct our misunderstandings of privilege and reveals our prejudice. Yes, the Assyrians did conquer Israel and did despicable and unimaginable things to them. Jonah would not have hesitated to deliver a message of punishment. Jonah hesitated to deliver the message because he believed God couldn't be trusted to go with wrath, but would rather extend grace, that would offer forgiveness rather than punishment, that would extend life to the Ninevites rather than give them death. Even as faithful doves, Israel, like all nations, was not blessed by God for its behavior or claims of ideals being kept or virtues being around the people. They were blessed despite their vices. And so are we. What appeared to Jonah as God's apparent exclusivity to Israel did not end at the borders of Israel, but rather was always intended to be a conduit through which the world would connect with God. The plan always included our enemies, rather than giving us permission to suggest or even order their destruction and damnation. When we are at our most righteously indignant, we tend to reveal not our moral superiority, but our ignored hypocrisy. We are challenged to put our sense of superiority aside to provide space to take on the character of God, whose mercy is from everlasting to everlasting. Jonah had no room for God's mercy. Yet God had mercy for even Jonah's and Israel's sworn enemies. Nineveh is the only city who listened, while Jerusalem always refused. In some of the most observed parts of this whole observed story is the fact that even the cows of Nineveh are ordered to wear sackcloth through the streets of the capital, the Assyrians, while the prophet Jeremiah is recorded as being ridiculed for warning the false certitudes of lying royal yes-men prophets in the streets of Jerusalem. How often do we listen to the yes men proclamations of our place and time, assuring us of our privileges and endorsing our moral superiority at the expense of our very public displays of hypocrisy? The cycles of violence and blame between Israelites or Ninevites will only break when mercy is extended. The only way forward for any of us is to demonstrate what we have already experienced. The same mercy that has been offered and received by us. We cannot go in the opposite direction of God's call for long without confronting our disobedience. In times of disconnect or distraction, we need to be reminded of who we are to God and one another. As the prophets were rejected with their messages of change or consequences, so too was one who came to us as God's fullness in flesh. Those who should have recognized God in acts of mercy were only so hasty to prescribe their condemnations to save their comforts and to protect their powers. Whether it's Nineveh or New York City or Boise, Idaho or Decatur, Illinois or Portland, Oregon, as those who claim allegiance to one who offered mercy to his execution squad, who sought those who were the furthest away from God, alienated by religious authorities, outcasts within their own villages, hated for their relationships with perceived oppressors rather than seeking God's favor in damnable nationalism or racism. We must be ready to go, willing to speak, prepared to accept God's call to connect again. We can wait like Jonah for God to come around to our way of thinking. Yet God creatively is trying to connect with us, waiting on all of us Jonahs to come around to God's way of loving. It's interesting that the book of Jonah ends openly. We never hear how Jonah responds when God said, "You showed more compassion for a weed than for the thousands of people in Nineveh who desperately needed to be saved." Will God have to wait to have your response to his abundant mercy? Amen.